Hi, I'm Jake. Welcome to the channel. Today we're going to be finishing off this ITB install on my 1973 Datsun 510. In the previous videos, I removed the SU carbs, we put new fuel lines on, made up a manifold as well as other bits and pieces, and today we're going to be tackling the wiring and hopefully getting it fired up for the first time. So stick around to see how I get on. So this is where we left it at the end of the previous video. So the manifold itself is complete. The ITBs are held on with these Jubilee clips and stuff, so this is all done. Trumpets are done, it's their ASA. Along with some 3D printed hose guides and stuff. Also have fitted a boss underneath, if you can see it over there, for an intake air temp sensor. See it down there as well. Yeah, fuel lines are all buttoned up. I did vaguely put the vacuum lines in, but I'm not really happy with this sort of octopus look in here, so I might do something about that. But I think the biggest thing we've got to do today, and it's not going to be today, it's going to be spread over the course of a couple of days probably, but is the wiring. So you can see on the end here we've got a throttle position sensor, we've obviously got 4 injectors, we've got the intake air temp under here, and we're going to remove this fan switch and fit a water temperature sensor. This does actually trigger a relay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to wire in the ECU to trigger the fan relay, which controls this electric fan down here. So yeah, get rid of the switch, put a temperature sensor in the ECU, and then it can trigger the fan via a relay. I think once we've done the wiring, currently there's nothing else holding us back from giving this a go. Oh, I do need to wire in the fuel pump actually. So we fitted a high pressure fuel pump in the last video, which is in a different position to my previous fuel pump. So that's going to need a little bit of wiring, which might be a good place to start actually. Because once I've done that, I can prime the system, make sure there's no leaks, etc. So yeah, actually, let's start there. So this is what we're dealing with in terms of fuel pump wiring. So there's 2 ring terminals on this pump, and the negative is on this side, and the positive on the other side. Ooh, over here. And then I'm not sure if you can see on camera, but they are actually different sizes, so you can't get the wires mixed up. So in this case, the negative is the larger and the positive is the smaller one. I guess that stops you from putting the positive on the negative terminal, etc. So now I'm going to crimp some wires. So disappointingly stuck at the second hurdle. So I've crimped these connectors on, clear heat shrink, good to go this end. What I was going to do is sheath it in some of this stuff. So it's just like a braided tube of fabric. Then what we do is you put a bit of heat shrink over the end to neaten it up, and it'll protect the wires and it looks nice. But the only size I've got is this, which is a bit big. I thought I had some smaller stuff for this, so I'm going to get that delivered. Some next day delivery stuff, and I'll do it tomorrow. But for now, what I'm going to do is plug these in and see if the fuel pump works. So connect it at this end, and then all the way down the other end. Yeah, that's the wires. So I've got a ring terminal for the ground, and currently just a terminal on this end, which will plug into where the existing wiring ends. It's obviously way too long. I'm going to cut that off and do it properly, but this will do for testing purposes. So the braided sheathing has turned up. So I'm just going to sort this fuel pump wiring. So what I've done is I routed the ground cable first up inside the car. So it goes from under here where the fuel pump is, follows the fuel line up through the floor to the tank, and it's sort of grounded by the tank. So if you ever need to do any fuel system stuff, it's basically take the rear seat back off, which is nice and easy. So what I'm going to do is cover it with this stuff. So what I do is I'll slide some heat shrink down the tubing first, so both of them. Now that I've trimmed this to length, I can trim some of this to length, and I'll basically tie those together with that, and then, yeah, seal both ends with a bit of heat shrink. There we go, that's the loom protected. As you can see, I've got the old heat shrink on the ends. Stops this stuff fraying. I was reminded very quickly, after cutting this stuff, use a lighter to melt the end, because I didn't do that in this case, and it all started unraveling. But yeah, I remember for the rest of them. Yeah, it's coming okay. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to put this in the car now. So bolt this up to the pump, route all this, poke this up through the floor, and I'll terminate these inside the car once I know exactly how long they need to be. Obviously this one I've not cut down yet. So the ground will need a ring terminal on the end, and then not decided what to do with this. I might put a spade connector on to connect to the existing one. I might just solder the wires together. I'll decide when I get in the car. So I'm calling the fuel system sorted for now, and I'm going to move on to this bulkhead connector here. So this is currently where the wiper connects. I'm going to remove that and basically put a bigger electrical connector in there. And then I'm going to route all the wires, so the TPS, injectors, intake air temp under there, water temp there, and probably this other water temp here as well. I'm going to route all of those probably across the top of here and then through there. So in order to do that, I've got this. This is the same style Deutsch connector, but this is a 12 pin. I've already been up at the 3D printer and I printed off these little brackets. So you can buy bulkhead connectors of these anyway, but all the bulkhead connectors are basically what I've just made here. So just a little tab that slides on the back. There's a little like dovetail slot here with a retaining thing on it. So you just slide that all the way up till it clips, and then cut a hole in the bulkhead, and then fit this little plate over the front. And this one's got threads built into it, so just 3D printing some threads. I have run a tap through it, but you can just use them straight off the printer. And yeah, so I just have to enlarge the hole in the bulkhead to suit this connector, drill some holes for the bolts for this, and then I can put this in place. And once I've got this in place, then I'll know where to route the wiring. This is the wiper motor loom that I was pointed out. This is the wiper motor loom that I pointed out in the last clip that I've just removed. This is a pretty good example of what this loom's going to end up looking like. So this is that sheathing I was talking about. I think this is the size that I've already got some of, to be honest, but I need some smaller stuff for the fuel line because it's only 2 wires. Deutsch connector on the end, as well as, if it will focus, some labels. Yeah, basically go for exactly the same style as this, with Deutsch connectors and everything, and then at the sensor end it'll be whatever connectors those are. Yeah, this is what it's going to look like. I'm going to use all black like I have here with labels, just because I think it looks better, and for looms that are on display I think it looks a bit nicer than having this big multicoloured one. Definitely not optimal. Like, I think at this end's not labelled, so if you were trying to work out what was going on here, unless you get the loom off and get a multimeter across, it's not immediately obvious. Whereas if you use coloured wires, it would be. That's the compromise I'm willing to make. Hopefully on the loom I'm making now, I will be able to label both ends. So I've bolted it in place and I'm just going to scribe around the inside. What am I going to do actually? No, what I'll do is I'll do the hole down this end first. So I'll scribe around this, drill it out, bolt it through both ends so I know it can't move, and then I'll scribe around the inside of this with my little stick and Dremel it out to suit. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to reprint this though and just extend the sides by a mil or two all the way around, just because, I'm not sure if you can see it, but just at the top there, the slot that used to be there is just right on the edge there, basically nearly visible. So I'll just offset the outside of this by 2 mil or so. I'll keep the hole placement and the centre hole the same, just offset the outside by a little bit. But yeah, Dremel out the inside, and then I'll be able to bolt in the bulkhead connector. I've Dremeled out the hole in the bulkhead and fitted the connector. So this is the sort of outer half. Yeah, pretty well secured in there. Nice. And then a bit of a view back. Like I said before, so wiring is going to come from here all the way along the fuel rail and then bloop, into there. Should be quite neat and tidy, I think. And then if I ever need to take any of this lot off, it'll just be one little subloom like that, which will be nice and quick and easy to remove. And I'll worry about the wiper motor later on. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to route the loom sort of back inside itself into the scuttle void and then go through and pop out behind the glove box with a similar thing to this. Basically what was there before, but just the 6-pin version. So now it's time to start measuring up some wires. I lied, we're not measuring up wires yet. I'm going to fit this coolant temperature sensor first. So I'm just going to remove this fan switch. And if I remembered correctly, they should be the same thread pitch. So I think this is M14 by 1.5. And yeah, the good thing about this, it's a Bosch sensor. These part numbers and stuff, you can just Google them and get the data sheets, which makes it a lot easier when it comes to actually like calibrating these in the software. Because yeah, they'll have a full data sheet for this online. Breaking news, I'm an idiot. And in my infinite wisdom, I've overlooked something. And that is that this water temperature sensor is actually quite long. So sticks into the thermostat housing quite a bit into the space the thermostat's in. So when I first fitted this, it was clashing with the spring on here. So what I've done for now is I've just spaced it out with a load of copper washers. I think there's still enough threads. There's still like 4 threads or something holding it in. So a reasonable amount. But I think what I'm going to do longer term, so yes, I'll just leave it like this for now. What I'm going to do longer term though is swap out this M14 sensor for an M12. So a smaller thread. And then you can get adapters that will have an M14 on the outside, M12 on the inside. And I'll just thread one of those into the housing and thread the sensor into that, because that will just naturally space this out by the required amount, while also allowing sort of full thread engagement on the sensor and into the housing. Don't really need like a good ground on this thing because it's a 2-wire sensor. So some temperature sensors like this one are a single wire, which basically measure resistance to ground. They are not great. They're not the best sensors. Whereas ones like these are 2 wires, so you have the sort of feed to it and then it will ground via the ECU. A lot more accurate. Yeah, I think this will probably do for now. Suboptimal though. For this thermostat housing, I've got the old universal gasket set out again. Today's flavour is mango passion fruit yogurt ice lollies. So yeah, what I do is cut them out of cardboard, just basically trace around this, push them with your thumb. And then before you install them, I always find it's best to basically completely coat them in oil. Just get that absolutely soaking wet with oil. And that way it doesn't get stuck as badly to the housing, because the problem with cardboard is it absorbs the water and falls apart and then sticks to these. They never leak though, honestly. These never leak. I think the turbo oil drain on my Civic has had a serial box gasket on there for 5 years now with no issues. The previous one of this was serial box. Obviously, I don't use these sort of gaskets for anything critical, but for stuff like this, it's absolutely fine. Like I said, just get them soaking wet with oil first, and they're good to go.
So before we jump into wiring, I figured I should give you a quick overview of what we're going to be doing. So here is a diagram of the sensors I'm going to be plugging in. So we've got an intake air temp, a coolant temp, and a throttle position sensor. Ground and signal, ground and signal, ground, signal, 5 volts. All pretty basic stuff. The O2 sensor / lambda sensor is already connected, so I don't have to worry about that. And I've cropped off a external map because we are not going to be using that either. Injector wise, I don't have a cam position sensor, so I'm going to be running in batch. So that's where you have 2 injectors linked to one another. So this diagram shows 2 12-volt feeds, each going to 2 injectors, and 2 injectors paired together going to each signal in the ECU. So you basically fire twice per cycle. Pretty simple to set up, doesn't require cam position. So yeah, this is what I'm going to go with. And a brief overview diagram of how this is going to look in the engine bay. So I've got the coolant gauge, which I'm going to reroute. So that's an existing sensor, not going via the ECU, but I'm just going to reroute it with this loom. I've got the coolant temperature plus ground, as shown in the first diagram, TPS 3 wires, intake air temp 2 wires, and the injectors. This will be ground and signal each. And a brief list of what's going to be going through the bulkhead. So 10 pins. Should all be fairly straightforward, so let's get into it.
So here we have all the supplies ready to start making this loom. So I've got the connectors for the temperature sensors, so 2 of those, along with the pins and stuff for it, throttle position sensor, the 4 injector connectors, the bulkhead connector, some 1 square mil thin wall wire. That will support 10 amps or so at least, which is more than enough for any of this stuff, and it's pretty thin. Just gets a bit awkward when you start going thinner than this. So that's the size I like to use. I've got some labels over here, which I've just printed out on plain paper. And then in here, I've got some glue-lined clear heat shrink to go over these labels. And yeah, that's all of the supplies. Also got my old sheathing over here and stuff. So I think I'm going to start at the end furthest away from the bulkhead, which is the temperature gauge. So just thought I'd show a crimp from this connector. So this is the SN48B. You can pick them up for like a tenner off eBay. And yeah, nice solid little crimp on the end of this wire. Really, really worth buying if you're doing wiring. So there we go, connector is crimped on, a little bit of heat shrink over the crimp, silicone boot over the top, and then just a label out of printer, paper, with some clear glue-lined heat shrink over the top. Nice, neat little solution, should be pretty robust. Yeah, first wire about done. So I thought I'd show you something cool about these Bosch amp seal connectors, whatever they're called, that I didn't realise the first time I used them. I've since been corrected, but basically you take these little seals, put them on the wire before you crimp them, and what you do is you crimp them in as part of the connection, so they stay in there, and then that way when you push these back down in the back of the plug, the seal goes with it and is retained in the crimp, so they're really nicely sealed. Then you can also get these boots as well, which slide over the end, which help take some of the strain off the connection. But yeah, really good connections. Again, just using trusty old crimping tool. Gets you some very nice looking sort of OEM spec crimps. And here we have those 2 pins with the seals on in place. Yeah, little retaining clip. Ready for some labels. So this is the sort of setup I like to use to heat shrink stuff. So I've got the heat gun on the workbench with a rounded over tip, which sort of contains the heat and more evenly distributes it. When doing these little labels, you can see, probably in here, little focus, but that's the little paper label just inside of there. Sometimes they can get blown out by the heat gun, so what you can do is put that on and then let the residual heat sort of get the heat shrink started. Yeah, there we go, starting to shrink now. Job done, if that will focus. Nice little labels. So here we have some more connections crimped, very similar to the temperature sensor. This is for the Honda throttle position sensor. So yeah, 3 wires. They're all the same length for now, so what I'll do is I'll connect them all up and then label them for where they need to go. So there should be a throttle position sensor, like the signal wire, a 5-volt reference from the ECU, and then a ground, and I'll just tee the ground in with the other sensors. But yeah, slowly getting there. So here we have down here, the water gauge, water temperature gauge, water temp for the ECU and throttle position sensor. Underneath there as well, we've got the intake air temp, it's got some wires on it. So just the 4 injectors to do, and then I'll sort of sheath it all and terminate it. Really not a massive job. So I'll just show you in real time how quickly it is to crimp up these connectors. So yeah, pretty straightforward, exactly as per all the other connectors we've done so far today. Basically just crimp them, push them into the connectors, so strip the end of the wires. I've got an automatic wire stripper thing, but I just prefer to use some side cutters, some fairly sharp ones, just because I find that the automatic ones tend to like damage the insulation a little bit. Sometimes the sort of teeth can grip. So there we go, little seal on. Crimp in place. There we go, that's one. done. So yeah, pretty straightforward, pretty easy. If you're going to do any sort of proper wiring, one of these crimping tools is so good. I've got a couple of different sizes depending on the wires and stuff, but they're so cheap. It's almost a crime not to have one. So much easier than like soldering or... Okay, that's 2 done. Just gonna make sure I put these in the right way up. There we go, in the connector, and I'm just going to push the seals in a little bit. And then locking tab, done. There you have one injector wired up. Here we have all the engine bay end connectors fitted. I've just used some cable ties to tidy everything up. And this is the routing I'll be going for. So yeah, water gauge, water temp, throttle position, 4 injectors, intake air temp underneath, routed along the fuel rail, and then it will curve across into there. Got plenty of length left on all these wires, and I'll just trim them down when I need to. But before I do that, I need to join some of these wires together. So the plus 12 volts for the injectors needs to be joined together, as well as pairing the injectors. And some of the sensors are going to share grounds. But now I've got this all cable tied up, I can lay it out on the bench and decide where I'm going to make the joins. Figured I should probably show where I'm up to because I made a little bit of progress. So previously I terminated all the connectors and now I'm sheathing them and joining them together. So started at this end, the furthest, and then gradually working my way back. Got to remember to put the sheathing on and the heat shrink before you sort of join it into the loom. So I've done this connector here, which is cylinder 1. It goes into this. And then what I'll do is I'll tee in cylinder 4 when I get there. So I've already made some... So cut the sheathing off here and I'm going to solder them together and heat shrink. And yeah, slowly making my way through. The only thing I've messed up so far is this water temperature sensor. So it's teed off here and I forgot to put this heat shrink on before I teed this sensor and this sensor together. So then I couldn't get the heat shrink down to here. So I've just used tape, which is not too bad. And it did help me remember to do the heat shrink first. So yeah, gradually working my way through. So got cylinder 1 in, just put a big bit of heat shrink here for the bit that's between these two. And then I'll tee in this one, go to the next one, and then after I've teed in 2 and 3, I'll join 2 and 3 together because they're batch fired together. Yeah, slowly making my way through it. I think even now it's looking pretty reasonable. Here we are a little while later, and this loom is very nearly done. So starting at this end is the water temperature. There's a single wire for the gauge. Again, I've listed all of these 100 times already. Yeah, made my way all the way back down to this end, and this is the last bit to be terminated. So it's going to fit into one of these, and what I'm going to do, well, I mean, ideally, the shortest 2 wires that are here would have been a little bit longer, but it's fine. It's fine. They are plenty long enough. Just that, like, where I teed this one in is here. It doesn't really give me a lot of space here before. So that's going to be the end of the sheathing, and yeah, terminate onto that. So what I'll do is I'll trim all these down, label them up, and pin them up for this connector. And then I'll write down, sort of as I'm going, where I'm plugging them into this one. So I know when I start inside the car, I'll have like essentially a map for this plug, because although these will all be labelled, it's easier if I know which number's which, so I don't have to keep going out and checking labels and stuff. But yeah, overall, I think this sort of little sub-loom is looking pretty good. So I've labelled up all of these wires in about the same place, just to give a bit of clearance to the end of here. Basically, these 2 are the shortest, so I've started with those. And thought I'd show you what I'm using for these connectors. So generally, if you buy the cheap ones of these connectors, they'll come with open crimps. Bag like, that's not open crimps. Who am I kidding? But yeah, open crimps. But I prefer barrel crimps. They're easier and nicer. So that's about the only, I'd call this a specialty tool that I wouldn't expect everyone to own. I think a regular crimping tool like this, I think everyone should own one of these. But yeah, I like using these ones. They're very quick, very easy. You basically drop these pins into here, put the wire in the back and give it a squeeze. Job done. You can pick up kits like this for not a huge amount of money, and they generally come with that tool. And then you can also buy sort of top-up kits, but these cheap ones, they tend to come with open crimps in these ones, but you can buy bags of the pins by themselves. So that's what I like to do. So yeah, I'll basically trim all these down one by one, work my way through until these are all sort of hanging out same length. Then start plugging them into the connector, make a note of them all. And very soon, this loom will be done. So here we have this section of loom completely finished off. So I've pinned up this connection. I've also put some strain relief loops in here. So what I like to use is just like a screwdriver or something. Basically, when you're putting the pins in, you loop them round and back in. And what that means is that it allows a bit more flex at this joint here. That means if you move this loom, it doesn't try and pull the pins out of the connector as much. So try to do that whenever I'm using these big connectors. If there's only a couple of pins, it's normally not really worth it, but for the bigger ones, something like that's quite useful sometimes. It should mean this loom doesn't get damaged in future. And I've got my shopping list for doing the interior loom, which is what I'm going to make a start on next. But this can be installed now. I'm going to 3D print some more cable guides and stuff to go on the fuel rail. But electrically, done. So here we are inside the car, and I'll show you where the ECU is. So under here, we've got ECU here. We've got fusion relay board here, and then at the back over here, we can see the bulkhead connector that we just connected up to in the engine bay. So really don't have to do much wiring in here, in terms of length at least, because pretty much all of those wires come from the ECU to that connector, which is not very far at all. And then I need to tee in some 12-volt feeds for the injectors. And yeah, that's about it. So hopefully not too much work. So I've got the existing ECU looms out of the car. So this is how I was running it spark only. So there's two connectors on this ECU. It's a UA4C, if you haven't seen that before. But there's basically one that's got sort of inputs and one that's got outputs. And to run it spark only, this is basically all you need. So we've got some grounds, a 12-volt, a crank signal in. So I've got a Hall effect sensor, so it's a single wire. I've also got a lambda sensor, so that's what this one is. And then there's a single ignition output. So really simple to run spark only. Going to add a few more wires now. And what I've done is I've just cut down some lengths of the wire. I've just eyeballed them. These are going to be too long, so I need trimming down. In this case, I have gone for a variety of colours because they're not going to be seen, so it does make it a little bit easier. I've just used whatever I've had to hand. It's about the right size. And what I'm going to do first, I think, is go through, label all of these up as per these, decide which colours I want to use for which, label them up, and crimp on the ECU end connectors. And to be honest, this is my biggest issue with this ECU, is they're basically mini Molex connectors. These jobbies like you'd find inside a computer, and they're just a bit shit, to be honest. These wires are tiny, so I've had to use some fairly thin wires. These are honestly the worst bit about this ECU, and they're not really that bad. But there is now an Ocelot, I think it's called, which is essentially the same as the UA4C, but with a proper like automotive spec connector on it, which will be much better. But I've already got this, so it'll do. And I've got the same ECU on the daily and not had any issues. Again, strain relief on these, especially because these pins are not the most robust. So strain relief to stop them pulling out the connectors is a must. But yeah, so I'll pin these up, put the strain relief loops in and label them up. And we'll join me again in a few minutes. A short while later, I've terminated all of these wires and labeled them up. These are the 12-volt feeds to the injectors, which have some different connectors because they will not be getting their 12-volt feed directly from the ECU. And now what I'm going to do is using this wiring diagram times 2. So there's two different connectors for the ECU. I'm going to start connecting these two plugs. So, once again, me being an idiot comes back to bite me. So, I was just sort of marking out which ones I actually need to connect to the ECU. And I came across this note on the wiring diagram. Two wire Senor also fed 5 volt. Because this has just had me over. So when I wired these two up, so intake air temp and coolant temp, I wired them up grounded on one side, which is what the generic Speedwino wiring diagram suggests, which is commonly how some of these sensors are wired up, so I don't think anything of it. But this should actually be fed 5 volt on one side. Luckily, it's a relatively small change to correct this, because I've basically got the ground from these two and the throttle position sensor, so all three of these actually. So the ground from all three of those is connected. Turns out they actually all need a 5 volt feed. The TPS also needs a 5 volt feed, so what I've done is I've swapped what was the ground for all three of these to a 5 volt, which basically just involves switching the ground and the 5 volt for this one. And going to my labelling convention, so what was the ground is now a 5 volt, and what was 5 volt is now ground. So it says that the only one of these that needs a... Yeah, it's just inverted these, but a bit of a pain, because it means my labels are wrong. So what I'll do is I'll trim the labels off the loom. So I've already swapped these over on this end, if that'll focus. So these ground and 5 volt I've swapped around, and I'll just trim the labels off so as not to confuse myself in the future. Just a bit of a pain. Not the end of the world though. Otherwise, these wires are all connected up to where they need to be. So I'm going to plug these into the ECU and work out how long they need to be to fit into the bulkhead connector. Was just pinning up this connector from the bulkhead to the ECU, and one of the ground cables, wherever it's gone here, has pulled out of the little pin on this end, which is why I don't like these connectors. So it's left the connector in here. So what I'm going to do is use some staples. They actually work pretty good to fit in this end, to push on the little tabs so you can extract that. But yeah, staples, I like the perfect shape and size for this. There we go. Staples down either side of the terminal pin connector thing, and then that'll allow you to push the connector back out. So we're in the car. I've connected up the loom. The only thing I've not plugged in yet is the water temp gauge, so this one here, which is the wire you can see hanging down here. The rest of it is all connected up, and I'm moving over to the wanky laptop. This laptop is probably older than some of the people watching this video, and what I'm going to do to start with is go through and just flat map everything to 100% everywhere. So there'll be temperature correction maps for water, air, cranking, startup, all those sort of things. I'm just going to flat everything to 100% so they don't have any effect. Basically just try to get this thing fired up, and I want as little interfering as possible. So that's where we'll start. So another thing I need to set up in here is what injectors and stuff I've got. So Speedwino with Tuner Studio works on a VE map, so volumetric efficiency map. So what you do is you tell it how big your engine is, how many cylinders it's got, what your injector's flown, all that sort of stuff. And then it calculates how much fuel is going to be required. So I've got 1600. I think these are 190cc injectors. That's what I found online. We will see. To be honest, it doesn't actually matter if these numbers are wrong. It just means it's a little bit harder, and it might make the VE numbers a little bit silly if they're not correct. So I've done that. I've set it up for paired injectors, which is what I'm running. And yeah, just otherwise filled in all this sort of stuff. And I think I've just put some VE numbers in to start with. So yeah, I've just put a blanket 35 everywhere, and I'll give that a crank and see what happens. So this is future me in the garage, and what we're going to do now is we're going to skip forward to me actually getting this running okay. I'm aware this video is probably quite a long one so far, so we'll basically skip over a lot of the trial and error stuff. If you lot are interested, let me know, and I'll put that into another video. So there's a little bit of like messing about trying to get this thing to run properly. So yeah, we'll skip forward to it running, which should be the next clip. I love the smell of exhaust wrap in the morning. Well, actually it's evening, it's pitch black outside. It's idling. So there we go, that was first fire up done. Overall, I think it went okay. As expected, there was a little bit of trial and error and that sort of stuff to get it fired up. But it's running now, so pretty happy with that. Although before I go for a proper drive, there's a few more things I need to address. So the water temperature sensor didn't seem to be reading correctly. It was just pinned at 82 degrees, even when we first fired up. Clearly it wasn't 82 degrees yet. I think this is a sort of fail-safe value, so I need to take a look at that. Also, the lambda sensor didn't seem to be reading correctly in the software, so I need to take a look at that as well. Other than that, I need to go through and put some more accurate numbers in the various maps. So like loads of stuff I just flat map to 100% everywhere. So the temperature compensation maps, all those sort of stuff. Barometric pressure correction map, I've literally just flat mapped all of them to 100%. So I think I might go and put some numbers in those tables. And then hopefully in not too much time, we can go out for a little bit of a drive. And I think that's where we're going to leave the video today. So I've got it running, we've got it driving, we've been out and about. It's not perfect. There's a lot of work still left to do, but I'm aware this video is probably quite a long one. So we'll leave it here for now. If you've enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe and all that sort of jazz. And let me know in the comments if there's anything in particular about this build and this sort of process that you want to see. Hopefully the next video will have me mapping this car properly, sorting out the teething issues, getting it driving properly, and all those sort of bits and pieces. I think the next one should be a fairly quick one in comparison to this one, because it's just teething issues really. Thanks for watching, and I'll catch you in the next one.